Good afternoon. My name is Anin Day, and I'm Dean of the Information School at the University of Washington. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the first Information School and Center for an Informed Public joint lecture. This is the first lecture in a four-part series. I'd like to give a special welcome to the Information School and Biology alumni who are joining us for this talk. To get us kicked off, there really has never been a time when information has played a larger role in all aspects of our lives. From health and well-being to politics and social justice, information professionals are shaping our global response to the pandemic, combating misinformation and disinformation impacts on US elections, and bridging inequities in the criminal justice system and our access to education. And now, as we sit under a massive smoke here in the West Coast, we are dealing with misinformation about climate change. While this year has been full of upheaval and tragedy, it has also shined a light on the importance of information and the need to strengthen and promote democratic discourse. I can't think of a topic more timely than that of today's lecture: how to gain the skills to look at information and data critically, to identify the good from the bad, and not what you agree with from what you disagree with, and how to mitigate the impact of misinformation on your community. Today, we're extremely privileged to have Dr. Jevin West and Dr. Carl Bergstrom join us to talk about these challenges and their new book, Calling Bullshit: The Art of Skepticism in a Data-Driven World, available from Penguin Random House. A little bit about our speakers. Dr. West is an associate professor in the Information School and is the inaugural director of the campus-wide Center for an Informed Public. He also is a co-founder of the Data Lab, the nexus for research on data science and analytics. Jevin's research focuses on misinformation specifically in and about science. He builds models, algorithms, and interactive visualizations for understanding the flow of information in large knowledge networks. Two particular areas of interest are scholarly communication and intellectual property. Dr. Bergstrom is a professor in the Department of Biology and an affiliated researcher in the Center for an Informed Public. He uses mathematical models and computer simulations to study a wide range of problems in population biology, animal behavior, and evolutionary theory. When he's not busy combating misinformation about the pandemic, he focuses on understanding how organisms acquire, store, and make use of information, and how humans and pathogens evolve and co-evolve to shape medical practice. You will likely recognize Carl's name from the New York Times and the many other media outlets where he has been interviewed dozens of times since the start of the pandemic. As longtime collaborators, Drs. West and Bergstrom study how scientists perform their scientific work and share their results with the scientific community. And they've co-created and co-taught an incredibly popular class on misinformation at the University of Washington for several years now, and one whose curriculum has been picked up by more than 70 universities around the world. And this course has now led to their book, Calling Bullshit: The Art of Skepticism in a Data-Driven World. There's much more information on the book and the class at callingbullshit.org. We will hear from them about how to assess data, separate what's accurate from what's bogus, and how to fight back against misinformation with effective analysis and argument. We'll hear about examples to help us identify accurate information to combat misinformation, disinformation, and fake news. Thank you all for joining us today. Be sure to send your questions to the speaker using the link listed in the YouTube video description. Without further ado, I give you Drs. Jevin West and Carl Bergstrom. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thanks so much, and what a great welcome, and thank you to all for taking the time to join us today. It's a topic that's near and dear to Carl and I's research and professional hearts, but I think everyone here also recognizes the importance of this problem. I really think that this is at least the issue of misinformation, disinformation is one of the most pressing problems of our time, and it's really difficult to solve issues of population health, economic health, planetary health, if we can't get the information health part right. And so we're going to today mostly talk about some of the things that we talk about in the book, but we're not going to exclude examples not in the book. In fact, we're going to spend more of the time applying the same principles that we talk in the book to examples outside of the book and about the pandemic, specifically, of course, COVID, especially because Carl's really, truly one of the world leaders in this particular area. So without further ado, I'm going to get us started. So we'll have plenty of time for questions because that's when it really gets interesting. And I've seen some of your pre-questions, so I want to get to those for sure. But let's get through the lecture part. And as I mentioned before, this is a lecture that's been co-branded with the biology alumni and the iSchool alumni. So what a fun group that we get to have today. Okay, so I'm going to start. Can you see that, Carl? Give me a thumbs up if you see this. Perfect. Okay, so I arrived at the University of Washington in my current faculty position in 2013. And with my colleagues, Josh Blumenstock and Emma Spiro, we were charged, like personally charged too, with developing curriculum and research programs in the area of data science. So we formed this lab we call the Data Lab now, and we also spent a lot of time building curriculum in data science. And in doing so, I recognized that students were exceptionally well, better than I'll ever be, at replicating algorithms and working through the mechanics of statistics and computer science, but started to realize that it was the questioning of that data that we were sort of missing. But it was partly due to the time period, and you still sense it today. And I know there's a lot of people probably in this crowd in the world of data science, or maybe even they run or manage a large data science company. There is a lot of excitement still today, but in 2013, it was really through the roof. If you opened up any sort of newspaper at the time, and the New York Times, here's an example. I remember this article specifically. It's why I'm including it here. But this was another one of those stories talking about how these new brain-like machines, a lot of times they were talking about just these simple perceptrons, which are the sort of building blocks of these deep neural net algorithms, how these will make possible a new generation of artificial intelligence systems that will perform some function that humans do with ease. See, speak, listen, navigate, manipulate, and control. I think the one thing that's probably missing here is reproducing, but that's in there in some of these articles as well. But if you backtracked in time about 55 years, you would see almost the exact same words from Rosenblatt himself, who was sort of the father of this kind of field and certainly of these perceptrons. He was great at selling ideas. He was a very exciting individual and got people excited. And if you read the text in this particular article in 1958, you would think you were reading the one in 2013. So the Navy revealed the embryo of an electronic computer today that expects will be able to walk, talk, see, write, reproduce is in this one, reproduce itself, and be conscious of its existence. So how could you not be excited at the time? I certainly was as a faculty member, and the students were, and people still are. There's reason to certainly be excited about data science. I still teach classes in machine learning and do see a lot of potential. And I too was not immune to being overly excited. I will admit fully right now that this particular paper, this paper published in Nature, that claimed that by using search queries from Google or any major search engine could be used to predict influenza epidemics. Now, at the time, I mean, I remember reading the paper in 2009, 2010, and getting super excited. And it was going to be on my syllabus when teaching a data science class. And it actually was for some time after 2013. But it wasn't long after that where we started to see the community and the program itself, realize the real pitfalls and some of the problems with it. It was so bad, actually, that they had to actually take it down, and it's not up. Now, that hasn't stopped other research groups, even during this current pandemic, in wanting to use search queries and data from social media to make predictions on where the next epidemic will be. And we shouldn't stop doing it. But we were very much sold and excited, I think, in the field more broadly. And that comes to sort of this general issue that Carl and I have been seeing both in the education world and also sort of more broadly in the field. In fact, when I was telling Carl that I was going to teach my first big data class, Carl was like, "Well, I want to teach a class on calling bullshit on big data." And I said, well, that's a good idea. Let's do that. That'd be something worth our time. Probably the best thing that we could teach. And here we are today in 2020 talking about this issue as a real serious education curriculum and a mission that we have as educators and as researchers. So the issue here at the heart of everything that we were doing with this class and what we do with this book, and also even with a lot of the work I do in the center, is that we aren't teaching our students to question numbers in the same way that they question language and rhetoric and clickbait that they might see online. We're great at spotting bullshit. I guess not super great, but we're quite good as humans at spotting bullshit in words, but it's those numbers that are harder, and they really seem to just drop directly from nature. They seem precise and objective and scientific. Questioning numbers is just, it doesn't have, people just don't feel as confident about it. And we want to make people confident. And really honestly, the book that we wrote was very much it was as much an empowering book to make people feel like they could do that and make them smarter as much as it was a technical set of lessons. In fact, there's some numbers are so great that they almost seem to carry sort of this divine authority. And as someone who was trained in science and the beauty and the power of quantification, I've certainly sort of been in that camp as well. But the whole point was to make kids and students and the public question these things. So we formed this course, as Anin said, and it's been a lot of fun. It's grown into lots of different parts of the project. As Anin said, there's universities and classes around the globe that are teaching it. And more generally, it's something that I see driving a lot of my personal research, and I know Carl does as well. The fact that there's lots of universities teaching parts of it creates a community too. So there really has been this BS movement, and it led to this book that we published that was released in August. And there are various things that we talk about both in the class and in the book. And what we wanted to do today, when Carl and I were talking about this talk, we wanted to figure out how we could take the principles and the lessons that we teach in this book and apply it to the pandemic and to other things outside the book. And we do use some examples in the next set of slides, but we really wanted to show how these principles can be used everywhere. And when it comes to COVID, really it shows how they can even be life and death kinds of skills. I don't want to oversell that too much. Like I said, don't oversell sort of AI or anything, but I do think that it's these skills that we really need people to be better at, especially during times like COVID. So of course we can't have a book and certainly not a class about bullshit if we don't provide some definitions. So before we get started, I want to just mention briefly what our definition is and provide an example that really exemplifies this definition. So bullshit, we think, of course, involves language and rhetoric, but it also involves those other forms of a communication that we've been talking about so far. Statistical figures, data graphics, and other forms of presentation intended to impress, overwhelm, or persuade, and presented with a blatant disregard for the truth, logical coherence, or whatever information is being conveyed. So it's very much about impressing, grabbing your attention. In fact, many times we think of the platforms, the social media platforms, as kind of the biggest bullshitters of all, because they don't really necessarily care what we're reading or what we're learning. They just want to grab our attention. So let me give you an example. This is a favorite of Carl and I's, and we like to use it often. So many of you, of course, know of Sigmund Freud. From his writings, he wrote, so I gave my lecture yesterday despite a lack of preparation. I spoke quite well and without hesitation, which I ascribed to the cocaine I had taken beforehand. I told about my discoveries in brain anatomy, all very difficult things that the audience certainly didn't understand, but all that matters is they get the impression that I understand it. So for us, this is the perfect example of bullshit. It's intended to impress, overwhelm, or persuade, and presented with a blatant disregard for whatever information is actually being conveyed. So with that, let me switch over to Carl. Let's see if we got this figured out. We practiced a little bit beforehand. It's all yours, Carl. Steal it.
Okay, thank you. So I didn't take any cocaine before this, so I may stutter and halt at times, but I'll do my best. And I also want you to understand it, which is the other limitation that I'm facing. But what I want to do is I want to tell you about the way that this kind of thinking has come in to the world that we suddenly find ourselves living in. And so I'll tell you about my experience with COVID as an epidemiologist. My training is in epidemiology, trying to be part of the response to this crisis. And the first thing to note is that we all knew this was coming sooner or later. Epidemiologists have been very, very worried about a pandemic, about a respiratory pandemic from coronaviruses or from a new pandemic influenza or some other agent for a number of time. And over and over again, it seems like we kept dodging the bullet with H5N1 bird flu and things like that. But it was only a matter of time, and we knew that. And in 2020, our luck obviously finally ran out. And this has changed everyone's lives, not just epidemiologists, but obviously is affecting all of us in the public. And we've all had to sort of become epidemiologists on the fly, because understanding these things are critical to knowing how to keep our families safe, whether our kids are going to be back in school, what's going to happen to your job, and so many other aspects of life. The problem is that the COVID information landscape is fraught with falsehoods. There's so much misinformation and disinformation out there around COVID, and not so many people have the training that they need to know how to see through that clearly. And that includes both members of the public and epidemiologists who have been doing epidemiology, but have been really focused on scientific research that's being promoted and written and promoted in good faith and so on. So there is this sort of gap. And then we're dealing with here sort of a scientific a lapse in sort of scientific certainty as well. I mean, we know so little, at least when we started, we knew so little about this virus. It was never in humans before December 2019. And so we're really starting from scratch. So we're starting with so many unanswered questions, and then, sort of into this uncertainty vacuum of unanswered questions, we have a deluge of all kinds of things that are misleading. So there are these organized disinformation campaigns. Jevin and I started tracking these in February, where we had misleading rumors and falsehoods. These are a couple examples coming out of people were trying to make the Chinese government look bad, saying that sulfur dioxide bloom over Wuhan meant that there were huge numbers of bodies being incinerated, or this rumor about 21 million disappearing cell phone users, suggesting that the death toll was orders of magnitude higher than anyone had said. Within this country, we've had some disingenuous federal messaging. Trump claiming that it was going to go away on February 26th. Larry Kudlow saying something similar. And I mean, you're living this. I don't need to take you through the whole history of all of this, but can't necessarily turn to the White House to get the truth either. There are a ton of these fake studies out there being produced in astroturfing, where you have people doing things that look like scientific studies, that are actually just, sort of sophisticated propaganda efforts. This one claimed to have run a 2.5 billion person randomized controlled trial. Of course, it was total nonsense, but it came out right after Fauci had said, hey, look, there's no adequate randomized controlled trial of hydrochloroquine. And then a few days later, out came this very professionally produced website, not listing its authors, but claiming they were a bunch of scientists trying to stay anonymous, and claiming they'd run this enormous trial that, of course, wasn't feasible, and sort of misusing the language of science and so forth. The sort of way we communicate in science, people have been sort of moving toward this radically rapid and open presentation of data and information so that we can work as fast as possible. And so everyone is sharing preprints online without waiting for papers to go through peer review. And in general, that's a very good thing, but the problem is there's some real garbage out there. Here's one early paper that claimed that the coronavirus was bioengineered based on some analysis they'd done that was completely false, and the paper was subsequently withdrawn. But this is one of the most shared papers in social media. This is a sort of a dashboard that looks at social media sharing. This is one of the most shared papers on social media in history, even though it was only up for a few days before being withdrawn as a preprint. Some of you have been following the news in the last couple of days may have seen this paper. This paper was released a couple of days ago. This is another paper that claims that falsely that the coronavirus was an engineered bioweapon deliberately released. The paper doesn't go as far as saying it was deliberately released. The author, however, said exactly that on Tucker Carlson last night. Again, this is not solid work. It hasn't been properly vetted, but it's getting picked up by the media and amplified by the media. Peer review doesn't completely solve the problem. There have been some dreadful COVID papers. At Left, we have a paper explaining that COVID came from a comet. This is not true, but this is the claim of, or an asteroid or something like that. At Right, we have and everyone kind of knows that's silly. At Right, we have a much more serious problem. This was a paper that claimed, and was published in a very high-profile journal, that claimed that hydrochloroquine was actually leading to higher death rates in patients who were receiving it, and it resulted in the cancellation of a number of hydrochloroquine clinical trials because it wasn't safe to keep those people on the treatment arm. Turned out the paper was fraudulent and quickly retracted. So even in the top journals, you can get this terrible peer-reviewed work coming through. Reporting can be sloppy. I'll come back and touch on this example momentarily. People cherry pick examples of, if someone supports hydrochloroquine, they'll find the 2 papers that use small sample sizes and show that it seems to help. And then argue like, look, I've got the science on my side. If someone has some other argument, saying that the coronavirus is really bad or not bad at all or whatever, they'll pick the papers they want and promote those. So people may seem like they have scientific evidence behind them, but they don't necessarily tell you the whole story. And then all of this is wrapped up in the authority of numbers, which Jevin referenced earlier on, the idea that, if we present to you hard data, scientific information, these numbers are like actual facts about the world we're supposed to think. And besides, who are we, to challenge these fancy statistical analyses that people are putting together? And this is really what our book is about. The answer is that everyone can challenge this kind of garbage, and everyone can think clearly. You don't need a master's degree in epidemiology or statistics or data science or anything else to be able to think clearly about information that comes packaged as statistical, numbers, facts, and figures, and that sort of thing. You just need to learn some ways of thinking. And so, one of the key principles we talk about in the book is just the idea that numbers have to be presented in ways that allow you to make meaningful comparisons. I can give you numbers, but if they're just numbers and you don't know what they mean, if I say, oh, hey, the current estimation of the case fatality rate in COVID is 1.9% or something. That doesn't tell you a lot until I start to bring it into comparison with other things you know about. And so, for example, one might compare it to flu. So you commonly hear this claim that's false where people say, oh, like COVID, flu has a fatality rate of about 0.1%. And there are a number of problems with a claim like this that you can learn to think about and dissect. First of all, the COVID estimate is probably wrong. It's probably substantially higher. But the other piece of that is that these are 2 different fatality rates. In one case, the fatality rate for COVID that people are measuring is what we call the infection fatality rate. That's what fraction of everybody who gets infected, whether or not they are diagnosed or have symptoms or anything, what fraction of everyone who gets infected dies. The case fatality rate is of people who are diagnosed positive with a disease, what fraction of them die. So the case fatality rate tends to be much, much higher than the infection fatality rate, because with flu, most people don't even go in and get a proper flu test and diagnosis. So this is a situation where by confusing these different measures, people can make confusing claims. Another example, so ratios are a way to compare numbers. And here's one from Nate Silver over the weekend. Nate was trying to argue that maybe the situation on colleges isn't so bad. Nate's the sort of statistical brains behind 538 that a lot of people focus, but I think he kind of slipped up here. And so he did this sort of back of the envelope calculation. He said, there's about 20 million college students, and that's 7% of the US population, and they represent about 14% of the US cases. So colleges, at most are only about twice as bad as the general population, and people are making too big of a deal about COVID on campus. If you think about this for a minute, you might be able to see what Nate missed. What Nate missed out here, yes, there are about 20 million college students on campus, but only about a quarter of them are on campus now, because the UW hasn't started, other semester schools haven't started, and so many schools, including the UW, are moving to predominantly online education for the fall. So what Nate should have said is, well, there's about 4 million college students on campus, and so that is a much smaller fraction of the U.S. population. If he used the right comparisons, he would have seen that actually rates of COVID on college campuses are probably 8 to 10 times higher than what we're seeing in the population at large. So these are just sort of illustrations of the ways that sort of thinking about numbers clearly can help a lot. I said I'd come back to this media example. This was something that ABC reported. They reported about some new guidelines that the CDC had issued, and the CDC had said, look, if you have if you've had COVID already, you don't need another test for at least 3 months after that. ABC News then reported people who've been infected with COVID and recovered are protected for up to 3 months. And that made everybody freak out. You can see a whole bunch of concerned tweets to the right there. And people were thinking, well, gosh, we only have 3 months of immunity. This is terrible news. We're going to get it again and again, and we may not be able to make a vaccine and all of that. But it turns out that the ABC just hadn't clearly tracked what the CDC was saying. And this same mistake appeared in so many of the media outlets. What CDC was saying is that being beyond 3 months beyond your last infection is necessary for reinfection. So CDC is talking about the picture on left. The people who can be reinfected are a subset of those who are beyond 3 months. For people who are not yet beyond 3 months, they can't be infected. But the news outlets reversed that, and they thought that the CDC was saying sufficient. And so they reported that people who can be reinfected include everyone beyond 3 months and a bunch of other people as well, perhaps. And so by flipping this necessity versus sufficiency, the news sent out this story that got an awful lot of people scared. And this was just a matter of sort of basic logical thinking. And to track that back, how did you catch that? This is another rule we talk about a lot in the book. If something seems too good or too bad to be true, it probably is. So this seemed too bad to be true that, all of a sudden the CDC had this information that immunity only lasted 3 months. And if that happens, then what you want to do is you want to track that back to the source. So you want to go back to the original source. I went back to the original CDC report, and it was quite clear in the CDC report that they were saying that you have to be beyond 3 months to have any chance of getting reinfected, not that once you're beyond 3 months, you are definitely going to get reinfected. So that just illustrates the kinds of habits of thinking that we're trying to stress. And then finally, in this area, one thing we really talk about a lot in the book is actually the way that numbers can harm the decision-making processes that we go through. So there's something called Goodhart's law. It says when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure because people try to game that target, and they try to change their behavior in order to get high scores. Jevin pointed this out a decade ago in science. He says, given bad answers is not the worst thing a ranking system, a system used to evaluate scientific performance or productivity. That's not the worst thing it can do. The worst thing it can do is not only give you the wrong answer, but it can also encourage people to do shoddy science as they try to score high on these ranking systems. And unfortunately, we've seen this quite badly in the pandemic. Throughout, Trump has seen testing results as a metric that he's trying to keep low. It's a report card, as he sees it, on the performance of his administration. And so Trump has aggressively tried to reduce the amount of testing going on in the United States throughout the pandemic. Once this number of people infected becomes a target, it's no longer a good measure because it ends up we end up reducing the amount of testing going on. And then the worst thing is that interferes with our public health response as well. We could have a lot more tests if we hadn't had interference all the way along from the White House. Jevin, I think maybe I'll turn it back to you.
All right, I'm going to steal it back.
Okay, see if you can.
All right, here I am. Black screen, I think you can see. All right, so as Carl mentioned, there's a set of principles that anyone really can pick up. And I think that's really was one of our big motivations in writing the book and in a lot of the public work that we do right now, that we could spend a lot of our time talking just to the 10,000 data scientists in the world and make sure that they do good work, and that would be useful. But the rest of the world can do some of these things and don't need to be data scientists. They can follow some of these basic principles and catch certainly a large portion of these mistakes. So that's why I want to sort of emphasize this important point that's really struck me sort of in the face several times, that in the iSchool and in my research area and in computational social science, we spend a lot of time looking at social media. And certainly social media is playing a tremendous role. We could give the entire lecture, of course, on the role of social media in spreading misinformation, disinformation. That's a topic that we could talk about forever. But if you look at the percentage of adults who get their news, which platforms do you think they are? So look at that for a second and make your guess before I give you the answer. It may surprise some of you that social media, at least based on lots of different research reports, show that the majority or the percentage of US adults that get the majority of their news is about 20% of the population. If you look at the placement of these other means of getting news, it still is about 50% of US adults, and certainly higher if you look at older adults in the US, get the majority of their news from television. So how's television doing when looking or when communicating with data and graphics? And also, I was just going to mention that it dominates even more for older adults. So this is the kind of things that they're seeing on television. And we have an infinite number of these examples, but this one's from CBS. I'll try to make sure I hit every political side in terms of news here. But this one, I don't even know where to start. It's a pie chart. We talk about pie charts and the issues there, but you have, first of all, the pie chart doesn't add up to 100%. That's strange. You have these arbitrary time periods, today, last year, and for whatever reason, 1997. The MOE down there is the source for whatever reason. I mean, there's just problem after problem with this particular graph. But if we look at to COVID examples, we've had many of those over the last 9 months or so. This one, again, I mean, it's not even worth spending time trying to dissect because there's so many problems with it. When we talk with students that have more nuanced problems, those are fun to have. This one's almost, it's almost not even worth having the conversation. I mean, what does St. Louis, where was Philadelphia, the x-axis here, and it's going down? I mean, you could just make up stories. But it doesn't just happen on the right media. It certainly happens on left media too. This was on the Rachel Maddow show, looking at the differences in the number of cases in different Kansas counties based on different policies they had, and what they wanted to show and what they told in the story was this big difference that existed between the mass counties and the non-mass counties. But if you look at that graph for a second, you notice a very simple trick that you can use if you want to make differences look bigger. They changed the y-axis, the no mask go up to 14, the mask go up to 25. And if you were to replot this, our colleague Steven Strogatz replotted it because he grabbed the data or had the data and showed this is really what it would be. And it would be a different story, certainly, than the one that was told. So it happens on the left and right. We see it not just in the US, we see it, this is an example from national TV in Latin America. What's wrong with this one? We can't have responses, we're not in person. So you may notice that 218 all of a sudden became less than 165. These are the kinds of things that we want everyone to be looking out for. The problem is, we're not doing a good job in teaching these basic skills in reading graphs and tables, and certainly not in interpreting statistics. This particular study was done looking at the percentage of adults that could correctly read this particular chart. So you have on the y-axis here the average number of decayed teeth per person in different countries, and you have the average sugar consumption on the x-axis. And the study was, hey, let's ask a bunch of people which of these, A, B, C, or D, would be the correct interpretation. So go ahead and look at that for a second. If you picked C, at least you would have got it right on this study, but there's all sorts of problems with the study about misinformation interpretation. So first of all, there is this issue that it likely was probably less than 63%, given that there were, if you just took a random set of individuals and they randomly picked C, some of them are randomly going to choose C, right? That's one issue. But the other issue is that even just the answer that was given does sort of insinuate a causal link, and there's likely a causal link. We know that from doing research too, that the average, as you increase the sugar consumption, it likely leads to T. So we know that. So that's not necessarily problematic here, but there are all sorts of things that we could do in the education system that sort of set to the side some of the mechanics and spend more time in all different classes for humanities students and STEM students alike, thinking about graphs and talking to them in ways and having these discussions about whether it should be an assumed causal link or whether it really 63% is an accurate representation. But this is what we're getting from public health departments. So for those that have been following the COVID pandemic closely, you may have seen this particular graph come out of the Georgia State Health Department. Here they had looked at the case counts from various different counties and plotted those with time on the x-axis. The problem, if you look at that x-axis, the times are quite arbitrary. You have April 30th, then jumps to May 4th, and then comes back to the 26th of April. What they were trying to show, and they admitted mistake later and did fix things, you saw this declining trend. And this was during a heated discussion among policymakers in Georgia about whether to open or not. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt. And we do genuinely say that to students. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt. And they did correct it. So let's go with that. But not too long after that, on July 2nd, they had posted a heat map of the number of cases and had this image to show as they were talking about it in public and as they were tweeting these different messages of data that they had. And then there was an update on it on July 17th. And if you look at the two images, it doesn't look like there's a ton of changes, at least looking at the images. But there's clearly something wrong with this graph as well. If you look at the bins, they had been changed. And as we tell our students, if you allow us to change bins of histograms or heat maps or change them in various other kinds of visual communication, then you can tell pretty much any story that you want. And certainly that was the case. But again, admitted there was a mistake, there was takedown. Great, we want to see that. That's what we want to see. But then again, there was another plot that was put out. And this one, like many of them, they did spread quite far on social media. And users pointed these particular graphs out. And even in these graphs would note some of the issues associated with these particular graphs. So in this case, you're looking at the number of COVID cases over time. And then you have this very important 14-day window line. And that particular line is pretty critical to interpreting the issue with this one. So I'll pause for a second. What do you see as the problem here? Well, with a 14-day window, first of all, there's maybe not the full 14-day window had collected all the data. There are issues with these transient ups and downs based on how, when and how the data comes in. And if you actually fast forward it and look at what actually happened with that particular graph, you see there are these ups and downs very much about the data curation process, which we talk about in our class and also in the iSchool more broadly when talking to students about data. And so here was another example where data itself, just the imagery, sort of conveys a story on its own, especially if it lands in a tweet. But this is what we want students to do, is sort of look at it, question it, and at least start interrogating it like we interrogate other forms of information. Now, we see this, of course, at the state level and at the federal level. This was a graph from the White House showing how COVID testing was really sort of exploding, right? Well, if you look at this particular graph, it's something that most people are familiar with. It's a cumulative graph. And if you put any cumulative graph, as we all know, always go up. So if you want something to always go up, use a cumulative graph, but please don't manipulate. When we teach students how to do things, we hope they don't use them in bad ways, but we do talk about this. In fact, the very first lecture of our very first class in 2017 of the Calling BS class, we showed this famous cumulative plot that Tim Cook put out when he had just taken over the reins of Apple, trying to show this explosive growth of iPhone sales. But as someone else on the internet called him out on, if you don't look at the cumulative plot and you look at quarterly sales, it tells a much different story. And so again, that's the sort of lessons and the habits of mind that we want to create in students and the public more generally. And hopefully in doing so, it becomes almost knee-jerk when they see some of these mistakes instead of letting them slide and then sharing. All right, Carl, you got it. Oh, you're muted, Carl. Oh, Carl, I think you're muted.
Let's see, can you hear me now?
There, perfect.
Okay,
yep.
Perfect. Sorry about that. Okay, so one of the sort of key themes in the book, throughout the book, and I'll run through this quickly, we're in the home stretch here, is that you don't need to actually tease apart the details of how an analysis is done to be able to see the problems with it. Most of the time, you can think about, and this is kind of the key schema in the book, you can think about how we take data, we take those data and we put them into some kind of black box. It could be a fancy statistical analysis, it could be some kind of machine learning algorithm, whatever it is, and then out comes some sort of output, which we then interpret. And often the scariest part for an outsider is this black box, because who remembers, how you do a multivariate logistic regression, or how to code a random forest algorithm or whatever. Even if you work in the area, you don't usually remember the details, and so it's sometimes daunting to try to question that. But the key is that when these claims are BS, they're very rarely BS because something in the black box is BS. They're very rarely an artifact of the analysis. It's almost always because people have chosen inappropriate data to put in, or they've drawn inappropriate interpretations from the output. So I want to just give you a couple of examples of each of these from COVID, and then we'll wrap up. So on the data side of things, we really focus on in the book on what we call selection bias. You have a whole chapter on this in the book. And selection bias happens when you sample a set of people or items that differ systematically from the population you're trying to draw inferences about with respect to the question you're asking. When you look at data that are biased in this way, then you make misleading inferences about a population. So I'll start off with a really silly example. There's this meme that's been going around the last few days that Antifa must be starting the forest fires in the Western United States because there aren't any forest fires in Canada and there aren't any forest fires in Mexico. So here's a couple of examples. If the fires in Oregon and Washington are climate change, why do they stop at the Canadian border? And the answer to why they stop at the Canadian border is because these are maps of US fires. So, I ended up in this news item yesterday or today or something. Professors explain why US wildfires don't stop at the border in Canada. And it's just as simple as the fact that the maps people are showing are selection bias. They're maps, if you only look at the fires in the US, then you'll only find fires in the US. If you then go to look as you see in the upper left or bottom right at the fires that are in British Columbia or in Northwest Mexico, you will see that in fact those fires stretch all up and down the west coast of North America. So that's a very simple selection bias example. Here was another one. There were a couple of dentists in New York who argued that masks were causing serious dental health problems. And the reason they said this is because, wow, since the pandemic started, so many people in New York are wearing masks, and all of the, so many of the patients that come into their clinic have more serious dental issues than they're used to seeing. So they're used to having people coming in for a range of small cavities and that sort of thing. And since the pandemic started, people are coming in with broken molars and severe gum disease and that sort of thing instead of with these basic issues. And so they said, well, this must be because of the masks. Well, there's an alternative explanation, which you probably see, which is in the middle of a pandemic in New York City, where so many people are coming down with COVID. You're not going to go to the dentist for your annual checkup or to have a minor cavity filled. The people who are going to the dentist are the ones who are basically dealing with severe issues. And so it's not that the masks are causing anything, it's that there's a selection bias in terms of who are the patients that these dentists are seeing. They're the ones who have severe dental issues, given that they're looking during the pandemic. There was another example of something like this. There were a couple of doctors in Bakersfield who were trying to estimate the frequency of of COVID in California as a whole. What they wanted to do that because they wanted to guess, they wanted to get at what fraction of the population, what fraction of infected people were dying. And so what they did, they sampled all the patients who came to their clinic, and they said, well, they owned this urgent care facility in Bakersfield. It was the only place in town that had tests. And they found that of the people who came to their clinic, about a little over 6% of those people actually had COVID. And so they thought, wow, we can extrapolate that to California as a whole. And they did some demographic corrections and things like that. And if that was true, then COVID would have had a very, very low infection fatality rate, because if they're really way back in March had been 12% of all of California had was currently infected. The problem with their inference, of course, is who goes to an urgent care facility with the only tests in town in March during a major pandemic. Well, maybe if you had a severe traumatic accident of some sort, you have no choice but to go to the urgent care facility. But otherwise, the main reason you go in is because you think you might have COVID and you want to test. And so the population that they were sampling was not a random sample of people in California. It was a subset of people in California who had very good reason to suspect that they had COVID. So they ended up, again, dealing with selection bias and massively overestimating the number of cases in California. This actually really hurt us in the United States as well. We had this, and it's a little bit more subtle, but I'm going to try to explain it quickly. early on, we were very, very slow to catch that there was transmission, domestic transmission going on in the United States. We thought throughout February, really, that there was not yet COVID spreading freely in the United States. This was wrong. It had been spreading freely the whole time. The reason that we made this error was because of the screening rules for what did it take to get a COVID test in February. If you remember, you had to either have traveled to Wuhan or you had to have traveled to China and have a set of symptoms consistent with the COVID coronavirus, or you had to have had contact with a known U.S. case. So in each of those cases, in none of those cases are you testing anyone who might be part of a community chain of undetected transmission. You're only testing people who've gone to Wuhan. And so therefore, if it is spreading in the community, you'll never pick it up because you're never testing anybody who hasn't been to Wuhan or directly in contact with a known case from Wuhan. So by picking a unfortunate testing strategy, we guaranteed that we weren't going to pick up any domestic transmission until actually, in this case, scientists at the University of Washington got fed up with this, took matters into their own hands, started running samples they had for other reasons through these tests and found that indeed it was spreading in the Seattle area. So that was a case where selection bias, really cost us a month in the national response. Very quickly, there can be problems with output as well and how that's interpreted. Here's a little COVID example. This paper says bald men are at high risk of severe coronavirus symptoms. And the idea was that the paper found an association between baldness and COVID risk. The hypothesis is that there's this endocrine involvement in COVID, so that the same hormones, the same androgen hormones that cause you to go bald or make you more susceptible to COVID. They had a very complicated molecular biology sort of explanation or hypothesis for how this might work. And then Forbes had to publish this correction. Updated. This piece has been clarified to note that the study did not control for age, which is a risk factor for hair loss and severe COVID. So we know that people who are older get severe COVID. We know that people who are older are bald. They hadn't controlled for the fact that this association was generated by that very basic aspect of human biology. So these are not, you did not need to understand their molecular biology here to be able to see the flaw if you understand that older people are more likely to be bald than younger ones. Jevin, I'll let you wrap things up.
Yep, I'm going to wrap it up. And I will do it quickly because I want to get to those questions. So I'll just say quickly that Carl and I could have written the entire book probably about selection bias. Those are some of our favorite ones to talk to the students about because it immediately empowers them. And it's something you start seeing more and more often. It's one of those things that sort of crops up in every part of your life. So let me just finish with the take-home message. They're very simple. We're drowning in BS, and much of it is in quantitative form and have policy implications and population health implications. The COVID pandemic, as Carl's demonstrated, and a lot of the work he's done with this too, is put this really into a life or death context in all seriousness. And we need to, as consumers of this information and producers, many of our students become leaders in this area and they're producers of this too, we need to clean up our information environments. We have to do it now. And with all the smoke around us and all the other things that have happened to 2020, sort of I look to, Smokey the Bear, and we do this with our students. It sounds a little cheesy, but I grew up in sort of a forested area and certainly affected me. And really the message here is that it really is up to you. We can do things as communities. We can build legal infrastructure. We can do things to technology, try to deal with this issue of misinformation, disinformation. But really it is up to the consumers and those producing this. So with that, we'll end. Feel free to, talk to us anytime. You can reach out to us personal email or Twitter, or obviously go to our website here. And I'll end with another one of Carl's really beautiful pictures of campus. I sure miss campus. So with that, let's go ahead and take questions. Julia, do you want to start feeding us questions? Sorry for being
I've got Julia's first question right here, Jevin.
Oh, awesome. Let's do it.
Because I have it, I get to ask it of you. So,
oh, no.
What aspects so Julia says, what aspects or ideas of your Calling BS curriculum do your students have the most trouble with?
I would say correlation and causation, they have the most trouble, not because they are any less smarter than anyone else, or that well, I would say that it is partly we're not doing a good enough job in the education system, even on this more broadly, but humans have a difficult time separating causation, correlation. I've had students call it out on me when making claims, and it happens often. So I'd say that's one of those really difficult issues to contend with, and that just takes lots of practice. So I would say correlation, causation. What do you think, Carl?
Well, I think I was going to say basically anything I lecture on. But Jevin is the clearest, best lecturer. But no, I think one of the things that students struggle with is, and it is one of the most technical things we do in the course. But I try to teach the students about exactly what p-values mean and how they're misused, and how that if a science, if they say, oh, scientists showed with 99.99% certainty that there's life on this comet or something like that, that actually doesn't mean that we're 99.9% sure that life is on the comet. That p-value is a very different construct. And so I teach how that works, and that involves teaching a little bit of conditional probability. And it's a full lecture. And because we have students who are coming from 40 majors, this may be the only mathematics that some of them are seeing in college. We've got students coming in from the arts, humanities, as well as economics and law and business and then of course computer science and statistics and the natural sciences and so on. So I think that segment is challenging to try to understand what p-values are, and fair enough, because if you go around and ask professional scientists to explain to you what a p-value is, they will do a notoriously poor job. People have done studies on this, and the professional scientists don't necessarily understand this clearly either.
We should have that as an assignment, Carl. We should have the students go around and ask random professors around campus, although we'd get in trouble. They'd get so
I was going to say, not if I'm back on campus. Okay, so
next question. Okay. Oh, and also just to add to that, and more specifically about correlation causation, I would say that they struggle with sufficiency and necessity. As Carl, we had that example in there. When we do that part of the lecture, we ask questions on quizzes and exercises we do in class. That one in particular is tough for them. Okay. So how do we build data literacy and encourage rigorous inquiry in younger folks? And how do we suggest we start teaching children and young adults to call and speak up against BS? So I'll take the first question. So I think one of the things that we need to do is sort of balance the time that we devote in education to the mechanics, to showing them how to calculate a p-value rather than thinking about how to interpret it and what it means and what it doesn't mean. I think we spend too much time figuring out how to teach them quickly how to work through a particular statistical analysis, and then we don't spend enough time questioning the data. A favorite class that one of our colleagues teaches at another university takes papers throughout the quarter, throughout the semester, papers that have statistical flaws in them, and then have the students go through and identify those flaws. And it's that kind of teaching that I think does a better job with the younger folks. Now, if you're talking about really younger folks, I do think we should be doing this in the elementary level. I have a 9-year-old and 6-year-old, and they love sort of thinking about these kinds of things. I think students in general like to call BS on things, certainly on data and graphics. And I think they can do that. I think we're just catching up with the sort of data world and the data revolution that we're living in. And so when talking about BS, though, I do think that we really need to spend more time at the university level and below that, talking about civics and digital civics too. That calling BS isn't about showing how smart you are as an individual. Calling BS is really about making us all smarter, the community smarter, the room smaller, the dinner table smarter. And to do that, that takes sort of a delicate balance and sort of social skill that we need to discuss and teach them, because we want people calling BS and inviting it. We want, like when Carl and I have been calling BS each other, for 15 years, and Carl doing it on me more often because I deserve it. And I really think that we need to get to the position where we can build that into some of our cultural norms, where it's okay to call BS. In fact, you invite it, but you do it in a way that doesn't attack character, that you do it responsibly, you do it and you make sure that you're right and clear and concise. So these are the kinds of things, if we're going to do that, we do need to bring back civics into that discussion.
Yeah, great. So the next question, what advice would you have for journalists and others who engage with the community? If government officials and scientific journals, the sources that are usually relied on, are full of BS, who do we talk to make sense of what's happening? This is super important. I think, one of the things we stress in the class to our students is that is the need to triangulate and to seek out multiple sources of information. Journalists, I mean, a huge fraction of what we teach to our students is actually stuff that's lifted from the best journalists, right? So there are questions any journalist would ask that we teach our students in the first, second day of the course. When you're presented with a claim, ask, who's telling me this? How do they know it? What are they trying to sell me? So, you can ask those questions. And then the other thing we really stress is when you see claims, triangulate, see if, are multiple venues reporting this information, or are multiple venues just reposting the same report. There's obviously the important difference, especially when things spread so quickly on the internet. The best science reporters really know the communities that they're reporting on, and they always triangulate. They always call multiple experts in different areas. They don't just take the university press release about a study and then have a conversation with the author, but they'll call a few people that are also experts in the field, but not related to the study, and they'll keep building their knowledge in this way. And I think it's really just the best way to do that is to engage on an ongoing basis. Get to know that community and use that, use the scientific community in this case as a way to triangulate information about what's actually going on. You're muted.
The final question, it's a really important one, and I know there's lots of other questions we didn't get to. Please reach out to us. I think these are discussions we could talk about forever. But the final question gets at one of the core issues here, and that's this erosion of trust that's going on. The question is, how can we teach students or our community both to identify misinformation, but at the same time combat the cynicism and the erosion of trust that seems to be happening right now? And it is happening. In fact, it is one of the objectives of a lot of these disinformation campaigns. It's to erode trust in the institutions that we rely on, that we do need. And over the last several months, I've been having discussions with a new postdoc that we have about trust, and talking about trust in different ways that I haven't talked about. And she has this great idea, Rachel Moran is her name, that trust, that there's this conservation of trust, kind of like conservation of mass, where in the conservation of mass, you can't delete or add mass, you sort of transfer it. With trust, that what it's happening is it's not going away if people don't trust the mainstream media. It's just diverting to some other place in the internet, and a lot of times to places that don't have reputation, that don't have the training, that don't have the vetting mechanisms to at least make a good attempt at getting at what the truth is and what facts are. And so my fear is, even when talking about misinformation in the public and talking to it with students, it's something in the back of my mind all the time that I don't want in these discussions to actually add to that erosion of trust. And so when Carl and I talk about science, for example, and some of the issues in science and things that we need to improve, we always start and end the lecture by saying, despite these issues, science still works pretty darn well. And it has led to all these great discoveries. And so we want to make sure that when talking to the public, and certainly the younger generation, that we want them to know that there are experts. Those experts don't get it right all the time. There are certain experts that are more reliable than others, and there's things that they can do to sort of vet those experts. But we depend on experts. We depend on gatekeepers. We can't know everything. And so one of the things that we need to do in all this research and all this teaching is push back on this erosion of trust that's happening. And if you look at all these indicators, for the most part, trust across all institutions, most institutions, are going down. And that's of real concern to me. It's as big a concern as any individual news item that we need to fact check, for sure.
Yeah, I love that question. I mean, this is something that Jevin and I have been talking about since long before we actually walked out into the auditorium on the first day of the class, the first time we taught it, because we don't want to create this generation of cynics, exactly as you say. And I think what we've gravitated to is that we think the truth is out there, and this is an empowering class and an empowering book, because our idea is to tell you, you can find it, and you do not need to have the level of expertise that a PhD in an area would have in order to be able to find it. There are ways to for questions that you care about. There are ways to dig in, go back to sources, look for multiple reports, triangulate, think clearly and logically, and you'll find the truth. And so I think that message, as long as we keep that message forefront in what we're doing, we can avoid this, idea that of basically, furthering the some of these propaganda strategies about creating nihilist views.
Well, perfect. So I'm getting a note from Julia, and Julia is my boss for sure. So it's time to wrap up. We want to thank everyone for coming from the iSchool, the CIP, and biology. This recording will be posted and a link will circulate. And really, thanks for all the great questions. We appreciate you taking the time and look forward to talking to everyone in person someday. It will come and we'll get there. But thanks a lot for listening, and talk to everyone soon.
Thanks. Good night, everybody.